Right now, scientists are sounding the alarm over an unusually high number of manatee deaths in Florida, on average about 5 a day since the start of this year.
Every few years, in a quiet stretch of north-central Florida, engineers open a set of gates and do something that looks insane. They drain a lake, foot by foot. A reservoir that has sat there for more than half a century simply disappears, and a river everyone had written off climbs back up into the daylight, exactly where it used to run. But the river is not the incredible part. As the water pulls away, something else surfaces with it, something that should have died down there decades ago, and somehow never did. And once a season, hundreds of people paddle out to witness it. The canal that cut Florida in half.
Inevitable that this dam was going to fail, but civil engineers say the typical design life for a dam is 50 years, and this one was more than twice as old.
That lake is called the Rodman Reservoir, and it only exists because of a canal that no longer does. Back in the 1960s, Florida set out to build a shipping channel straight through its own middle. The plan was to let cargo ships cross the state instead of sailing all the way down and around the Keys. The entire point of the thing was connection, and it would go on to become the exact structure that severed a river from the ocean it had been reaching for thousands of years. But in 1968, when the dam went up, it was just concrete and rising water.
Well, what to do about a dam in Florida? Is it helping the state's economy or is it harming Florida's wildlife?
And most of Florida called it progress. The project had a name, the Cross Florida Barge Canal. And here is the strange part. The idea behind it was older than almost anyone working on it. People had been dreaming about slicing a waterway clean across Florida for literal centuries. A Spanish explorer floated the possibility as far back as 1567. The state legislature created a commission to study it in 1821. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal poured money into it in the 1930s, brought 6,000 workers into the city of Ocklawaha, then ran dry and left the half-dug trenches to fill in with weeds. You have to understand how badly Florida wanted this. A ship leaving the Gulf side and needing to reach the Atlantic had to run the entire length of the peninsula and around the Keys, hundreds of extra miles of open water, weather, and time. A channel cut straight across the middle would erase all of it in one stroke. And to the men drawing those maps, the Ocklawaha was not a wild river with its own life running through it. It was an obstacle standing between two coastlines, and obstacles were there to be removed. The dream refused to die. It came roaring back in February of 1964, when the Army Corps of Engineers broke ground in earnest, the federal government finally authorizing the work and putting real money behind it. After a century and a half of plans and commissions and false starts, Florida was finally going to cut itself in two. And the machine they built to do it had a name too. The Crusher.
The big monster crusher crawler machine and huge piles of...
They called it the Crusher. It was a massive rolling machine built to flatten everything in the canal's path, and it chewed through Florida forest like the trees were made of paper. There was nothing gentle about it. Whole stands of hardwood and cypress went down in its tracks, cleared to make room for a channel that ships might one day pass through. The Rodman Dam rose across the Ocklawaha River, and behind it, the water began to climb. And I want you to sit with what that number actually meant on the ground. When it was finished, the dam had flooded roughly 7,500 acres of floodplain forest. It had drowned more than 20 natural springs, and it had buried close to 20 miles of the Ocklawaha's original channel under a flat, brown pool. 7,500 acres is not a field. It is a forest, an old one. Hardwood hammock and cypress that had been standing since long before anyone alive had a name for it. The Crusher did not clear that forest so much as erase it, and the rising water finished the job, pulling the stumps under and holding them there in the dark for the next 5 decades. A river that had run cold and clear toward the Atlantic was now a reservoir, sitting still in the heat. Within just a few years, the people who built it would understand exactly what they had done. And here's the thing that still gets me. That was not even the part that made people angry. The canal was never supposed to stop at the Ocklawaha. It was meant to keep cutting all the way across the state. But the planned route would have sliced straight into the Florida aquifer, the underground source of drinking water for millions of Floridians. Engineers warned that the canal could let salt water and pollution seep into that supply and turn it undrinkable. A project sold to the public as a gift to commerce was quietly threatening the water under everyone's feet. That is exactly where the most unlikely figure in this entire story walks in. The woman they called a housewife. Her name was Marjorie Harris Carr. The newspapers liked to describe her as a simple housewife from a small town called Manatee, which made for a tidy little David and Goliath headline. And it was wrong, flat wrong. Carr held a master's degree in zoology. She had trained as a scientist, worked as one of the first female federal wildlife technicians in the country, and understood the ecology of these rivers better than most of the men signing off on their destruction. Now, here is a detail I cannot get out of my head. Years earlier, Cornell University had refused her a place in its graduate ornithology program for a single reason. She was a woman. Think about that for a second. The person who would go on to out-argue the United States Army Corps of Engineers had once been turned away from a classroom because of her gender. Carr founded an organization called Florida Defenders of the Environment, and she built a case against the canal that was patient, technical, and relentless. She and her allies argued in hard scientific terms that the project would devastate the Ocklawaha and the springs that fed it. It was one of the first times anyone in the country had walked into a federal courtroom and tried to stop a public works project with ecology instead of politics. And that is a far harder thing than it sounds. In 1971, you could not simply argue that a river was beautiful or that people loved it. You had to prove, in the exact language courts actually respected, that the harm was real and measurable, that the springs and the fish and the drinking water were all connected in ways the engineers had never bothered to account for. Carr and her scientists did precisely that. They out-detailed the very people whose entire job was detail, and it worked. On the 15th of January, 1971, a federal court granted an injunction halting further construction while the case played out. 4 days later, on the 19th of January, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order suspending work on the Cross-Florida Barge Canal outright. The project was only about a third finished. The crusher went quiet. A housewife from Manatee, as the papers had it, had just stopped the federal government of the United States. But the story was not done, not even close. If you are finding this as strange and compelling as I am, take 1 second to subscribe. This channel goes deep, every single week, on the wild places America almost lost and the fights being waged right now to bring them back. And this one, I promise you, only gets stranger from here. A dam that serves no purpose. Here's the strange part. Stopping the canal never actually stopped the canal on paper. It took nearly 2 more decades of legal and political grinding before Congress officially deauthorized the project in 1990, finally killing a canal that had already been dead in the water for almost 20 years. The abandoned corridor was handed over to the state and turned into public land. In 1998, it was named in honor of the woman who had stopped the bulldozers. Today it is the Marjorie Harris Carr Cross-Florida Greenway, more than 70,000 acres of protected land stretching across central Florida, threaded with hundreds of miles of trails. The scar the crusher left behind became one of the largest greenways in the state. There was just one problem. Stopping the canal had never removed the dam. The crusher was gone. The canal was dead. But the Rodman Dam still stood across the Ocklawaha, holding back its reservoir for no reason anyone could quite explain. The structure had been engineered with a design life of 50 years. From the day it was finished, that 50-year clock had already started running, and the dam was on course to outlive its own engineering by a wide margin. So, why is it still there? Follow the money, and it comes down to fish. The flooded pool behind the dam had become a destination. The Rodman Reservoir grew into one of the most popular bass fishing spots in the entire region, and a state senator named George Kirkpatrick fought hard to keep it exactly the way it was. He won that fight. A dam that served no transportation purpose, built for a canal that no longer existed, was kept standing by politics and fishing. Today it does not carry the canal it was built for. It carries his name. The structure is officially called the Kirkpatrick Dam. And if you are wondering how a dam with no purpose stays standing for half a century, so is most of Florida. It does not move ships. It does not carry cargo. It exists to hold up a fishing lake and to spare the state the cost and the political fight of ever taking it down. On paper, It is an aging liability, holding back a river nobody asked it to hold back. For years, that is more or less where the story stalled. A pointless dam, a beloved fishing lake, an old fight that nobody could quite win. It could have stayed a footnote forever. Then something changed 100 miles away, out on the coast, and it dragged this quiet little river straight into the middle of a far bigger emergency. A species running out of time. Okay, this is where this stops being a story about one old dam and becomes a story about something dying. Florida's manatees were starving to death, and I want you to picture how we even know that. The people who count these animals do it the hard way, low and slow in small planes out over the shallows, tallying dark gray shapes against the sand below. Add up their most recent surveys, and you land somewhere between roughly 8,000 and 12,000 manatees across the whole state. That sounds like a healthy animal, right? Hold on to that number. I need you to watch what happens to it. Because starting in late 2020, along Florida's Atlantic coast, the seagrass that manatees graze on collapsed. Nearly 90% of the seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon had vanished over the previous decade, much of it smothered by pollution and algae blooms. The manatees, with almost nothing left to eat, began to starve. Wildlife officials declared what they call an unusual mortality event. And that clinical little phrase hides something brutal. The same people who spend their careers tracking these animals spent the winter of 2021 tallying carcasses instead. More than 1,100 manatees died that year. It was the deadliest year for the species ever recorded. Starvation does not happen all at once, by the way. It happens slowly, across a cold winter, as an animal that has to eat almost constantly simply runs out of anything to eat. Manatees are enormous, gentle, slow-moving grazers, and they were turning up thin and weak in the very places they had always gathered to survive the season. And the response was almost surreal. I promise I am not making this next part up. State biologists started hand-feeding wild manatees. They trucked in romaine lettuce by the ton and dropped it into the water at warm water gathering sites, just to keep the animals alive through the cold. Picture the crews standing out on those platforms in the cold, shoveling greens down into the water, while dozens of huge dark bodies crowded in below them, like livestock at a trough. At a single feeding site, that program went through more than 390,000 pounds of lettuce in one winter. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of lettuce, fed by hand to keep a wild species from starving to death. Read that one again. And here is what everyone on those platforms already knew. It kept the animals alive. It was never going to fix the problem. You cannot hand feed a wild species forever. The lettuce was a stopgap against a much deeper question. If the coast could no longer feed the manatees, then where on earth were they supposed to go? The crisis was bad enough that it reopened an old argument about the manatee itself. Back in 2017, federal officials had downgraded the Florida manatee from endangered to threatened, a more relaxed level of protection. After everything that followed, scientists pushed back hard against any further downgrades, warning that an animal that had just lost 1/10 of its population in a few brutal years was in no shape to lose protections. Officials reviewed the status again, and, at least for now, kept the manatee listed as threatened rather than restoring the endangered label. It was a narrow, cautious decision, the kind that buys a little time without solving anything underneath it. And time, for the manatee, is exactly the thing running out. The warm water problem. Here is what almost nobody outside Florida understands about these animals. Manatees cannot survive cold water for very long. In winter, they crowd into the few warm refuges they can find, and more. Then half of Florida's manatees now depend on the warm water discharged by power plants to make it through the season. At the Big Bend Power Station near Tampa, the warm outflow draws so many manatees that the plant runs a viewing center, and something like 500,000 tourists come every winter hoping to catch a glimpse of them. It is one of the strangest wildlife spectacles in the country, and it exists almost entirely by accident. Sit with how strange that is for a second. An animal that has lived in these waters for a very long time now survives the coldest months, largely on the exhaust heat of industrial machinery. It works, right up until the machinery gets switched off. And across the state, one plant at a time. That is exactly the direction everything is heading. Over the coming decades, many of those plants will be retired, modernized, or switched to cleaner energy, and their warm water will vanish right along with them. When it does, the manatees are going to need somewhere natural to go. And this is the part that made my jaw drop when I first understood it. Florida springs are exactly that somewhere. They flow up out of the ground at a steady 72 degrees year-round, warm enough to shelter manatees through the coldest nights. And some of the finest spring habitat in the entire state is sitting right there behind the Kirkpatrick Dam, submerged and cut off. The exact habitat these animals are going to need, the natural warm water refuge that could one day replace those power plants, already exists. It does not have to be built or engineered or invented. It is sitting under the Rodman Reservoir right now, flowing at 72 degrees in the dark, walled off from the very animals that need it by a dam that stopped having a purpose 50 years ago. And we already know the animals want it. A handful of manatees fight their way up towards Silver Springs every year by squeezing through the metal and concrete of a lock at the dam, a structure that was never built for them in the first place. Researchers estimate that if the Ocklawaha were reconnected to the St. Johns River, more than 500 manatees could make Silver Springs and the lost springs of the Ocklawaha their winter home. Everything is in place for it to happen. The springs are flowing. The animals need them. The only thing standing in the way is the dam. And one very stubborn question: will Florida ever actually take it down? Turning the faucet back on. While the fight over one dam played out, it was easy to lose the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is huge. Silver Springs, the Silver River, the Ocklawaha, and the St. Johns together form a single connected system that runs for 217 miles, from the heart of central Florida all the way to the Atlantic at Jacksonville. Before 1968, water and wildlife moved through that entire length freely. The dam broke the chain in a single spot, and the whole system has felt it ever since. Fish that once ran the full length of it, from the interior springs out to the Atlantic and back again, hit a wall of concrete and simply stopped. A migration route that had worked for as long as there had been, a river was severed in one stretch in 1968, and it has stayed severed ever since. And the numbers on reconnecting it are the kind that stop you cold. Breaching the dam would return more than 150 million gallons of fresh water a day to the St. Johns River system. Advocates describe it as simply turning a faucet back on. Water that used to pour into the St. Johns every single day before 1971, and just stopped once the dam went up. It would uncover 20 drowned springs and reopen hundreds of miles of river for fish to migrate the way they once did, all the way between the interior of the state and the open sea. A waterway that has been a flat brown pool for 2 full generations would run clear and cold and moving again. One economic study out of Florida Atlantic University projected that the restoration would more than pay for itself, returning more than $2 in value for every dollar spent, while adding hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars a year in recreation revenue from paddling, fishing, and tourism along a free-flowing river. On top of that, in 2024, federal officials proposed designating nearly 2 million acres in Florida as protected critical habitat for the manatee, a sign of just how seriously the animal's future is now being taken at the national level. Line all of that up and the case almost makes itself. More fresh water, 20 springs back in daylight, hundreds of miles reopened for fish, a warm water refuge waiting for a species that is running out of them, an economy that grows instead of shrinks. On paper, it is close to the rarest thing in a fight like this, a decision where almost everyone comes out ahead. And yet, the very same dam that drowned those springs is the only thing keeping the base fishery the locals love alive. The knot at the center. That is the knot sitting right at the center of this whole fight, and it is a real one. For the people who grew up fishing the Rodman Reservoir, removing the dam does not look like restoration at all. It looks like the government draining a lake they treasure on the strength of promises from outsiders who do not live there. Some of them argue that the reservoir actually filters polluted runoff that could otherwise feed algae blooms downstream in the St. Johns. And that claim is not simply dismissible. It has been both supported and challenged in different scientific reports over the years, which is a big part of why this argument never seems to end. So let me be honest about that distrust, because it is not irrational. These are people who watched the state build a dam that made no sense, keep it standing for reasons that made no sense, and then show up decades later, insisting that the same government which got it wrong the first time has finally got it right. From a dock on the Rodman, that is an enormous amount to take on faith. The fish are real. The lake is real. The promises are paper. Restoration supporters have spent years trying to answer those fears directly. They have rewritten their proposals to fund the surrounding towns, protect local recreation, and build out the river economy that would replace the reservoir. And they point out something worth sitting with. A healthy, free-flowing river tends to grow its own fish over time, potentially producing a stronger fishery than the artificial pool ever did. And this is exactly where the drawdown comes back into the story, because the drawdown is the closest thing anyone has to proof. The river that comes back. Every 4 or 5 years, the state deliberately lowers the Rodman Reservoir. The water drops from around 18 feet above sea level down to roughly 11, and for a few weeks the reservoir nearly empties, and the original river returns. It is not a slow trickle of change, it is a reveal. Week by week, the water pulls back and hands the landscape its old shape again. Sandbars, channel, springs, all of it exactly where it used to be, like a room uncovered after the furniture sheets come off. This is the drawdown those crowds come out for. This past winter, hundreds of them went out onto it. They floated through the bare skeletons of that drowned cypress forest, the trees still standing exactly where they died decades ago, gray trunks rising straight up out of the shallows. And then they reached the springs. Because this is the thing nobody expected. 20 springs had never stopped flowing. All those years under the reservoir, in the dark, they had kept pushing cold, clear water up through the limestone, precisely where the old maps always said they should be. The reservoir never killed the river, it just sat on top of it. People who saw those springs boiling up out of the sand described them running as if no time at all had passed, as if the river had simply been waiting, all these years, for someone to let it breathe. There is something almost eerie about the footage that comes back from these drawdowns. Paddlers gliding over water so clear you can see straight down to the sand, threading between dead gray trunks that mark where a forest used to stand, and then drifting over a patch of river that visibly churns from below, cold and constant. A spring that has been pushing upward without pause since before any of them were born. It does not look restored. It looks like it was never actually gone. For a few short weeks, the dead reservoir becomes a living river again. And then the gates close, the water climbs back up, and it disappears once more. And if that sounds like the kind of thing that would settle the argument once and for all, it hasn't. Not even a little. Because the dam is still standing right where it always was. The fight that will not end now. You would think. With all of that lined up, somebody would just take the dam down. Stay with me here, because this is the part that will make you a little crazy. Because the support has actually been there. Former Florida governors from both parties came out in favor of removing it. At one point, about a decade ago, a deal to take the dam down was brokered by Susie Wiles, a political operator so formidable she would later go on to become White House Chief of Staff. And even she could not get it across the finish line. The reservoir's defenders have simply outlasted everyone who ever came for it. And that is the pattern, over and over. The science lines up, the money gets found, a governor or a chief of staff or a full committee lines up behind it. And then, somehow, it stalls, the water stays high, and the springs stay buried for another few years. After a while, you start to wonder whether the dam is being held up by concrete or by sheer inertia. Watch how close it got. In 2025, the Florida legislature finally approved money to begin removing the dam, roughly $6.25 million to start freeing the Ocklawaha. And then, Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed the funding and the project stopped before it could even begin. So in 2026, advocates came back with new legislation, a bill that would require a formal plan to take the dam down and reconnect Silver Springs to the St. Johns by the year 2032. And here is the maddening part. In committee, it sailed through on a unanimous vote, opponents and supporters alike. The bill passed the full Florida House. Its companion measure in the Senate cleared committee. And then the legislative session simply ran out before the full Senate ever brought it to a vote. No final action. The river stayed exactly where it was. And the structure they keep fighting over just keeps quietly getting older. Think about this. The Kirkpatrick Dam is now 55 years old. It was engineered to last 50. It has been flagged as a high-hazard structure, carrying a multi-million-dollar backlog of deferred repairs. And engineers have warned that a failure could send tens of millions of dollars in damage downstream, with lives potentially at risk if the water ever broke loose. It costs more than $1 million a year just to keep a purposeless dam operating. So the argument for removing it is not really about nostalgia for old Florida. It is about a single piece of infrastructure that has outlived its purpose, its design life, and its budget, sitting directly on top of habitat that a starving species may very soon need in order to survive. And underneath even all of that, there is one more argument still smoldering, and it is about the manatee itself. An argument over the animal itself. Here is a question you would not expect to still be open. Does the manatee even belong here? Some researchers digging through old archaeological sites have found surprisingly few manatee bones in Florida's ancient settlements, which has led a handful of them to suggest the animals may be relatively recent arrivals to these waters, rather than ancient natives of them. And I want to be clear about this. It is a genuinely contested idea, not a settled fact. But the people fighting to restore the river are wary of exactly how it could be used. Because here is the fear. Any hint that the manatee was never truly a Florida fixture could quietly become an excuse to weaken its protections. When people cannot even agree on whether the animal belongs here in the first place, agreeing on how to save it was never going to be simple. What is waiting underneath? So here is where we actually stand, right now, as you are watching this. The Kirkpatrick Dam still stands. The Rodman Reservoir still covers 20 springs and 20 miles of drowned river. The manatees still crowd around aging power plants every single winter, waiting on warm water that may not be there in 30 years. And every 4 or 5 years, for just a few short weeks, Florida lowers the water and lets everyone see exactly what has been waiting underneath the whole time. A living river, springs that never once stopped flowing, an entire ecosystem holding its breath. Every piece of this is sitting there unresolved, all at the same time. A dam decades past its engineering life. A species one hard winter from the next crisis. A river that keeps rising from the dead to remind everyone exactly what is possible, and then sinking back down again before anyone can act on it. The woman who started this fight, Marjorie Harris Carr, spoke of the Ocklawaha as something close to a dream, a place worth a lifetime of fighting for. She died in 1997, decades before the dam she fought would ever come close to falling. She never got to see the drawdown crowds. She never got to watch hundreds of people paddle out over the bones of that forest to visit springs she had spent her whole life insisting were still alive down there. But she was right about them. And every few years, the water drops, and the river proves her right all over again. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and I really do want to know where you land on it. If a river everyone gave up on can rise back to life in a matter of weeks, springs still running cold and clear after half a century underwater, then what exactly are we still waiting for? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to be here when this story finally breaks, one way or the other, subscribe and stay with me, because this one is not over, not even close.